welcome to the Political Corner, and this week we're focusing on local election issues, right? So the issue that we're going to take on to this week is the Alexandra protests that have been happening and that have been all over the news. And this is a really interesting story because it's really the nexus of the election process, but at the same time, local grievances at the same time, but also other issues such as like migration, such as urban renewal, and etc. So let's just jump into it, and I'm sure it's going to be really, really exciting. So first, let me just, for people that don't understand where Alexandra is, let me just give you a brief history, like a brief context of where this place is. First, it's located right next to Sandton. It's one of the poorest places in the country that's juxtapositioned by one of the richest places in the whole continent. In fact, the richest place in the continent, since Sandton is the richest square mile in the continent. And just like a brief history of Alexandra, it was founded in 1912. And because it was founded in 1912 on a farm, inherently, it was one of the few places in urban South Africa where black people could own land, because it was actually founded before the 1913 Land Act. Anyway, fast forward, we see that Alexandra grows fairly quickly after its founding. By 1916, it has like 30,000 people, which back then was actually a lot of people. But inherently, it's not taken care of by any municipality. So the city of Joburg just does not kind of recognize it. And then we see that there isn't a lot of investment that is put into the township. Not that townships at that point really got a lot of investment, but even compared to that time, fairly low investment. So anyway, we get to the 1960s and the apartheid government decides that it needs to do something about this place, but needs to do something about it in kind of like a very negative way. It decides that, it's going to demolish family-owned homes in Alexandra and instead invest in single-sex hostels. This was part of the apartheid policy of that urban areas were not meant for black people. If black people were in urban areas, they were there on a temporary basis. And there's really a long history of really the struggle against apartheid in Alexandra, but we're not really going to focus on that today. So when we get to democracy, you already have a township that has gone through a lot of trauma, a lot of violence, but also a lot of underinvestment as well. And then in 2001, under the administration of the African National Congress in the city of Johannesburg, the Alexandra Renewal Project starts. Now there was about 1.6 billion that had been allocated to this, but you need to understand that allegations have come out to actually say that this was actually used as a slush fund for ANC election campaigns, whether it was in the city or it was provincially as well. And there's really little evidence to see that, that kind of project has actually materialized into much. Just to kind of give you like a geographical understanding of Alex, in the 2011 census, it had almost 200,000 people. You'd imagine now it has more than that, and those people live in a 7-kilometer square area. You compare that to Soweto's like 200 square area. You can see that it's a very small township, but also at the same time, there's been a lot of informal settlements that have been springing up next to the Jutskei River. And really those people are prone to flooding every winter. So those are just some of the dynamics that in Alex. So given this history of like underinvestment in this township, a lot of migrants internally and externally moving into the place, but also which puts a lot of pressure on the services there. We see that in 2008, that Alexandra actually becomes a place where xenophobic violence actually starts breaking out. And we know that while xenophobia is a driver of xenophobic violence, it tends to be a scapegoat. Migrants tend to be a scapegoat for a number of socio-economic issues that are within the community. And of course, one of them was the fact that people were not getting jobs, people were not getting the services delivered to them. So let's fast forward to 2019, where we have the Alex total shutdown, and I'll just explain that to you. So basically at the beginning of April, Alexandra residents, which is something not abnormal in a country that has a high degree of protest such as ours, they decide to barricade Alexandra. So their grievances have to do with service delivery. It has to do with basically the fact that Alexandra, in their opinion, is very full and there's not a lot of space, illegal connections, crime, substance abuse, and just a whole bunch of community issues that I think are not unique to Alexandra, right? And so mentioned, they barricade the township and they demand that Mayor Mashaba actually come through. Mayor Mashaba says that he did not have time to come through. So just for some context, Mayor Mashaba is the DA elected mayor of Johannesburg. Since in 2016, the ANC lost Johannesburg for the first time. So anyway, Mayor Mashaba cannot make it, and then he sends one of his executive members. Obviously, if you understand community protest, this was not something that community members were going to be happy with, so they kind of dismiss this guy and say they want Mayor Mashaba. Mashaba refuses to go down there because he says, him and the DA's position is that essentially these protests are being aggravated by the ANC because it is election season. And then we even have a strange situation where Solly Msimanga, I think, who's the DA's premier candidate, actually decides to go lay charges against the ANC for inciting violence. Anyway, these protests go on, and I think it was about a week ago, the protesters decide to march to Sandton, to the regional offices where they'd expect to hand over a memorandum to Mashaba. Mashaba is not there, and now the situation is, of course, escalating, and he's getting a lot of critique from residents about his inability to actually respond to the situation adequately. So obviously the ANC sees that, okay, this is an opportunity in election season that we can actually, get some relevancy as it be. And so it's Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of our beautiful country, and David Makura, the premier of Gauteng, go there in ANC regalia and speak to the people, and it's well attended at the stadium, and inherently they promise that they're going to put ministers to actually see what's actually happening in Alexandra. Cyril Ramaphosa promises that, the ANC government is going to build 1 million houses. And then he publicly declares that your mayor is scared of you.
So your mayor has said that he is not going to come now. I said, let me wait so that the mayor, who is responsible, should come first. Atla ikutlwela ka boyena, atla iponela ka boyena, a le mamele. Ka bane meara ha tshwanela hore a tshabe batho ba hae.
So you can see here's an issue that has become an issue about local grievances that has become kind of a national political game as it be. One interesting part is the reason that the DA is actually able to rule in Johannesburg is because they've got the support of the EFF. And the EFF also sides with the DA in saying that this is a situation that has been aggravated by the ANC. Anyway, fast forward, after getting a lot of critique on, I believe it's Friday the 12th, Mayor Mashaba finally met with community leaders after 2 weeks of protests, and then promised that he would visit people in Alexandra on the 15th of April. So we were going to see how that goes. But I think what this does is it highlights a number of issues within a kind of an election season, right? And that we're going to discuss in our analysis. The first thing I think we need to understand about kind of the Alex Soto shutdown, whatever hashtag you've been following on Twitter in order to actually follow the story, is that it's inherently a microcosm of what many communities are going through in South Africa, right? We know that sometimes this can be the protest capital of the world, especially in regards to service delivery, right? And as a result, I wouldn't say as a result, but maybe inspired by these protests, we've seen protests in Soweto that has brought up about local issues there, in Khayelitsha, in the Free State, in KZN, and a number of townships in Tshwane as well. Now, not all of them, but a degree of these municipalities where the protests are taking place are DA-held municipalities, and the DA has actually come out to say that this is an ANC orchestrated thing before elections. But I think that's kind of a limited view of what is actually happening right here. So if we get into it, Alexandra, is very obvious from what I've just explained, is obviously a township that has just been neglected over the years. I know if you're from Joburg or you're from Gauteng, if you go to Alexandra, for instance, you can see the stark differences in planning, but also in service delivery compared to townships such as Soweto and other more kind of, I wouldn't say established townships, but bigger townships, right? So there's obviously a disparity, and people have a right to actually protest and say, well, we're not getting the services we need. But at the same time, the elephant in the room here, I think a lot of people don't want to talk about, and a lot of protests have brought up, is the issue of migration within Alexandra. You see, I don't belong to the kind of group of people that believes that you don't speak about migration or migration policy or immigration or all of those things. I think if it's something that people are concerned about, it's something that we have to speak about in a democratic and non-violent manner. And I think when we tend to keep quiet about what is the effect that immigration is having on us, positive or negative, and it should be fact-based, right? I think it fosters this kind of eerie silence in society. You don't deal with what xenophobia actually is, and as a result, we have instances where kind of xenophobia breaks down, but we don't have a sustainable conversation that gets hate out of people and actually starts speaking about the issue as it should be spoken about. So that's my opinion. But at the same time, we also seen that in this process, in the election process, a lot of politicians have started kind of scapegoating migrants for really the failures of politicians in this country. And I don't think that is good. That is not a sustainable way to have a conversation about migration and immigration in this particular country. So I think we really need to call out people who are using this as a means to scapegoat migrants in that in our country. But the second issue is really about how the DA is handling this. So it's not the second issue; it's more like the third issue. But yeah, numbers have never been my strong point. Anyway, so it's about the DA. And before I jump into the DA, I need to declare my own bias, right? Because I think it's really important for this conversation. I think if you're interested in politics, you have to get involved in some kind of way. And obviously anyone who's interested in politics is going to have a particular ideological leaning, vote for a particular party. And my particular party that I do support and I've supported for a number of years is the African National Congress. In my videos, as well as in this particular video, I've been very critical of the African National Congress, especially on issues of corruption, right? So I do want you to understand that I am, being objective. Right? But I think that it's very important that I declare this before I go and critique the DA, for instance. So let's get on that. First and foremost, the DA has come out to say this is something that's orchestrated by the ANC. And here, this is not the first time that the DA has actually come out to say, well, these protests are happening all over the country in our particular municipalities are something that's orchestrated by the ANC. When there was coup protest in Khayelitsha in the early 2010s, the DA actually said this is orchestrated by the ANC as well. And we actually start to see that anytime there is a protest, they blame someone else. And they don't actually sit down and actually say, maybe we're not providing the best services we can. I have a major problem with this. Because inherently in the mind of the DA, or how inherently they communicate, what they are saying is that we are so perfect at local government, at the provision of services, that there's no way that these people could really be protesting against us. They must have been instigated by another people. And I think you're really insulting people's intelligence. Because I've been to Khayelitsha, for instance. The DA ran a township for more than 10 years. And anyone who's been to Cape Townships knows that they're not the epitome of service delivery. In fact, they seem to be the opposite, right? And I'm not saying that they're much worse than ANC-run municipalities or etc., etc. All I'm saying is that the idea that no one could protest against you because you are so perfect is ludicrous. And in fact, it even reminds me of when the apartheid government would defend itself against protests happening in the country and say, well, these people aren't really protesting us, it's because they've been instigated by communists. You're insulting people's intelligence, right? That's the first thing. But I also think for a party such as the DA, which has had a really rough year and a half, it's very hypocritical for them, especially a party that speaks about accountability and etc., to always want to run away from being accountable in their own municipalities, in their own particular municipalities, right? And rather want to blame other people. I don't think it's a good showing, especially in an election year. And I think it's part of the reason why some polls have come out and actually said that the DA is only going to record about 14% in these upcoming elections. But we must also be fair to the DA, especially here in Johannesburg. What has happened in Alexandra is not, the neglect that's happening in Alexandra is not the result of just the last 3 or I think it's about been 3 years since the local government, about 3 years, right? It's because of a long history of neglect that the ANC is also responsible for. But people are also protesting in Alexandra that the services have dropped since the DA came in. And I think that it's high time they actually take responsibility for it if they actually want to retain the city in the next coming elections as well. a number of civil society groups have actually come out to actually say that this kind of protest season, or the protests that are actually happening, should not be used as a means by political parties to kind of instigate problems, right? And make kind of local issues worse in order to win votes. And I think I agree with them. I think Alexandra has become an example of when that happens. But one thing I'd also like to make you aware of is that during elections, protests seem to spike. And the reason for that is, especially when you come from a neglected community, you understand that politicians are willing to jump through various hoops in order to kind of secure your vote, right? So you use that to your advantage, and it's really a part of our dynamic political process. But at the same time, I think if politicians are actually doing their jobs, you actually prevent protests from escalating within an election season as well, right? But I think one thing that's important to note is that that doesn't mean that politicians should be irresponsible at the same time. For instance, in kind of responding to the DA, the president, Cyril Ramaphosa, came and he obviously, campaigned in Alexandra, which is not the problem. But I think the problem that I particularly had with that thing was promising people that the government is going to build another 1 million houses, when you know especially that one of the points of contestation within that particular place is the issue of housing, right? But also too, I mean, when we look at the numbers, it just also doesn't make sense, right? Because you're saying you're going to build 1 million houses within 5 years, right? But at the same time, we've actually built a lot of houses in the last 20 or so years. But in 25 years, we've built almost 3 million houses. Wow, English. We've built almost 3 million houses, right? But to say that you're going to build 1 million houses in 5 years just doesn't make sense, especially when the state doesn't have a lot of money left. So I just felt that that was kind of a promise that could not be kept. And I think a number of political parties have been making a number of promises in these particular protests that they themselves cannot keep. So I think it's important that people have to, especially political parties, have to be responsible, especially when you're dealing with local grievances. But ladies and gentlemen, that is just kind of a really quick analysis and a quick overview of what's happened in Alexandra. And one thing I want you to remember is that it is a microcosm of the issues that multiple communities are facing in our society. And if we actually want to prevent kind of these situations from playing out, right, we also have to think, how do we elect governments, right, and elect particular politicians, because this seems to be around the board in every political party, right? Politicians that are actually going to make sure that they're doing the work continuously during their term and not just when elections come up or start making promises. We need leaders that are sustainable and actually keep their promises. And I think you as the voter are really going to need to enforce that. So ladies and gentlemen, that is the Political Corner. Another week in South Africa. Remember to subscribe, and most importantly, please engage.